The rain sliced through the triple canopy jungle like liquid silver, each drop hammering the broad leaves before finding its way to Sergeant Daniel Westmoreland's neck. He stood motionless, his uniform soaked through, watching as the Japanese patrol passed less than 20 yards from his position. His finger rested lightly against the trigger guard of his modified Thompson submachine gun, a weapon he'd personally adapted with a folding stock and shortened barrel for the dense jungle warfare of New Guinea. It was January 15, 1943, and Westmoreland had just made a decision that would violate direct orders but potentially save his entire reconnaissance platoon from the 32nd Infantry Division. The standard military doctrine demanded that reconnaissance units avoid engagement and report enemy positions. But Westmoreland had spent 3 months in this green hell and learned what headquarters staff in Australia could not understand. Japanese patrols were using high ground to coordinate larger troop movements, and this particular officer carried a map case that might reveal their entire defensive line along the Kokoda Trail. As the enemy squad moved deeper into the vegetation, Sergeant Westmoreland signaled silently to his men, their faces streaked with improvised camouflage made from jungle plants he discovered could be crushed to form a paste that wouldn't wash away in the incessant downpour. No one in the War Department knew that this 27-year-old former factory worker from Pennsylvania would demonstrate a form of jungle combat adaptation that would eventually reshape the Army's entire approach to Pacific warfare. What happened in the next 4 minutes would directly influence the survival of more than 40,000 American soldiers preparing to fight in an environment more alien than any battlefield in American military history. Daniel Westmoreland grew up in the small town of Hazleton, Pennsylvania, where his father worked as a coal miner for 34 years. Young Daniel spent his childhood hunting in the Appalachian forests, developing an uncanny ability to move silently through dense woodland and track animals across seemingly impossible terrain. His mother, a nurse at the local hospital, taught him basic first aid and the importance of keeping wounds clean, knowledge that would later save countless lives in the bacteria-laden jungles of the South Pacific. The Westmoreland household was modest but dignified. His father, James Westmoreland, had survived the notorious Latimer Massacre of 1897, when sheriff's deputies opened fire on unarmed miners, striking for better conditions. That experience instilled in him a fierce independence and a distrust of authority that he passed to his son. "Question everything," he would tell young Daniel, "especially men who give orders without getting their hands dirty." This philosophy would serve Daniel well when the rigid military hierarchy faced the brutal realities of jungle combat. During the Depression years, Daniel's tracking skills became essential for putting food on the family table. While other families in Hazleton struggled with hunger, the Westmorelands ate relatively well thanks to Daniel's ability to bring home deer, rabbits, and wild turkeys. He learned to move through the forest in any weather, develop his own ammunition when factory cartridges were unaffordable, and fashion simple but effective snares from available materials. He could identify edible plants, navigate without a compass, using natural landmarks, and predict weather changes by observing animal behavior and cloud patterns. In 1937, at the age of 22, Westmoreland took a job at the Bethlehem Steel Factory, where his mechanical aptitude quickly earned him a position maintaining the complex machinery that shaped America's growing industrial might. He had a natural gift for understanding how things worked and improvising solutions when standard approaches failed. This talent for mechanical improvisation would later serve him well when standard military equipment proved inadequate for jungle warfare. Dan could fix anything with baling wire and a pair of pliers, remembered Harold Greiner, who worked alongside him at Bethlehem Steel. The engineers would say something couldn't be repaired without ordering parts from Pittsburgh, and Dan would just smile, disappear into the scrap pile for 20 minutes, and come back with a solution that worked better than the original design. This innovative mindset would prove invaluable in the jungles of New Guinea, where supply lines stretched thousands of miles and replacement parts were often unavailable for months. Westmoreland also had a reputation for challenging inefficient procedures. When the factory implemented a new production system that slowed down output, he methodically documented the problems and developed an alternative approach. Rather than going through official channels, he implemented his system on the night shift when managers weren't present. After production numbers increased dramatically, the company adopted his methods throughout the factory, though they never officially acknowledged the source of the improvement. When Pearl Harbor was attacked on December 7, 1941, Westmoreland didn't wait to be drafted. He volunteered the following day, telling his fiancée, Margaret, "Someone's got to show these boys how to fight in the woods." His hunting background and mechanical skills quickly caught the attention of his training officers at Camp Shelby, Mississippi. While most new recruits struggled with basic marksmanship, Westmoreland was consistently hitting targets at ranges that impressed even veteran instructors. Margaret Jensen had been Daniel's sweetheart since high school, the daughter of Swedish immigrants who had settled in Hazleton to work in the textile mills. She was as practical and resourceful as Daniel. When he enlisted, she took a job at an ammunition factory in Allentown, determined to contribute to the war effort herself. "We'll fight this war together," she wrote to him, "me making the bullets and you firing them." Their letters would sustain Daniel through the darkest days in the Pacific, though he kept from her the true horrors of what he experienced. During infantry training, he distinguished himself further by creating a modified web gear arrangement that distributed weight more effectively across the shoulders and back, a small innovation that allowed him to carry more ammunition without the crushing fatigue that plagued many soldiers on long marches. His squad mates soon copied his design, and within weeks, the entire company had adopted what they called the Westmoreland rig. His drill sergeant, Master Sergeant Victor Lombardi, was initially skeptical of Westmoreland's modifications. "The Army's been designing equipment since before your daddy was born, Private," he told him during an inspection. "What makes you think you know better?" Westmoreland respectfully demonstrated how his rig allowed a soldier to carry the same load with significantly less fatigue and better balance when moving through rough terrain. After testing it himself on a 20-mile training march, Lombardi became a convert and helped spread Westmoreland's innovation throughout the training battalion. Westmoreland's innovations weren't limited to equipment. During field exercises, he introduced his squad to hunting techniques that proved remarkably effective in military operations. He taught them to identify game trails that could serve as unobtrusive movement corridors, to recognize disturbed vegetation that indicated recent human activity, and to use natural materials for impromptu camouflage. In night exercises, his squad consistently outperformed other units in navigating difficult terrain and locating objective points without detection. His first sergeant, William Davis, took notice of these improvised equipment modifications and assigned Westmoreland to develop specialized training for the company in fieldcraft and shooting. "Most of these boys are city kids," Davis told him. "They've never spent a night in the woods, let alone tracked anything more dangerous than a taxicab." Westmoreland took to the assignment with characteristic thoroughness, developing a 3-day course that taught basic woodland navigation, animal tracking techniques, and silent movement. The course quickly gained popularity beyond his own company. Officers from other units began sending their men to participate, and Westmoreland found himself instructing soldiers from throughout the training regiment. His methods were unconventional. He would have trainees remove their boots and walk barefoot through wet areas to better understand how to read tracks. And he organized nighttime stalking competitions where teams would try to approach a sentry without detection. These unorthodox techniques raised eyebrows among some traditional officers, but the results spoke for themselves. What neither Westmoreland nor his commanders yet realized was how directly applicable these skills would be to the jungle hell that awaited them in the Pacific theater. His natural adaptability and instinct for improvisation would soon make him an unofficial but vital training officer for jungle warfare tactics that simply didn't exist in any Army field manual. After completing his training at Camp Shelby, Westmoreland was assigned to the 32nd Infantry Division, the famous Red Arrow Division, drawn primarily from National Guard units from Michigan and Wisconsin. The division was initially slated for deployment to Europe, but rapidly deteriorating conditions in the Pacific Theater led to an abrupt change in orders. In April 1942, they received word they would be shipping out to Australia, and from there to the largely unknown battlefields of New Guinea. The 32nd had a proud history dating back to World War I, where it had earned the nickname Les Terribles, from the French for their tenacity in battle. Many of its officers and senior non-commissioned officers were veterans of that earlier conflict, well versed in the tactics of European warfare. They had trained extensively for the set-piece battles they expected to fight against German forces in France or Italy. The division's heavy weapons, equipment, and tactical doctrine were all oriented toward warfare in open terrain, with established front lines and clear objectives. The sudden reassignment to the Pacific Theater created immediate challenges. Training had to be reoriented virtually overnight, with little guidance from higher headquarters about what to expect. The War Department itself had limited understanding of jungle warfare, and there were few experts available to consult. Officers scrambled to find information about New Guinea and the Japanese forces they would face, but reliable intelligence was scarce. "We were going in blind," recalled Lieutenant Colonel James Thompson, a battalion commander in the division's 126th Infantry Regiment. Most of us had never even seen a picture of New Guinea, let alone known anyone who'd fought there. We had plenty of training for hedgerows and wheat fields, but nothing for jungles and swamps. The division received some hasty training in Australia before deploying to New Guinea, but it was grossly inadequate. Australian instructors attempted to prepare them for jungle conditions, but the training areas around Brisbane bore little resemblance to the dense rainforests of New Guinea. They practiced amphibious landings on sandy beaches, conducted rifle ranges in open fields, and heard lectures on tropical diseases, but had no real opportunity to experience the challenges of moving, fighting, and surviving in actual jungle conditions. Some officers, recognizing these limitations, sought out men with relevant experience. Westmoreland's reputation as a woodsman led to his assignment to a special reconnaissance training section, where he was tasked with developing techniques for small unit patrolling. Drawing on his hunting background and the training methods he'd pioneered at Camp Shelby, he created realistic scenarios that forced soldiers to navigate by natural features rather than maps, move silently through dense vegetation, and maintain sensory awareness in an environment where visibility was severely limited. Westmoreland's method seemed strange at first, remembered Private First Class Thomas Dougherty, who participated in this training. He had us blindfolded, feeling our way along a course he'd set up in the woods. He'd have us lie motionless for hours just listening to the forest sounds until we could identify each one. We thought he was crazy until we got to New Guinea and realized he was teaching us exactly what we needed to know. What awaited them was a form of warfare for which American military doctrine had no precedent. The steaming jungles of the South Pacific would require a complete rethinking of everything from small unit tactics to weapons handling, from medical care to communications. And men like Daniel Westmoreland would lead that transformation, not through official channels, but through the kind of battlefield innovation and tactical disobedience that often shapes warfare more profoundly than any headquarters directive. In the summer of 1942, the war in the Pacific had reached a critical junction. The Japanese advance had been halted at the Battle of the Coral Sea in May and decisively turned back at Midway in June. Now the Allies were preparing to take the offensive, and New Guinea would be the proving ground for a new kind of American soldier, the jungle fighter. The strategic importance of New Guinea could hardly be overstated. This massive island formed the northern shield for Australia, which had become the primary Allied base in the Southwest Pacific after the fall of the Philippines. Japanese forces had seized the northern coast of New Guinea in early 1942 and established major bases at Lae and Salamaua. From these positions, they launched an overland offensive aimed at Port Moresby on the southern coast, the last major Allied stronghold on the island. If Port Moresby fell, the Japanese would gain an ideal staging base for air attacks against northern Australia and could potentially cut the sea lanes between Australia and the United States. This would effectively isolate Australia from Allied support and might force it out of the war. The stakes could not have been higher for the Australian and American forces tasked with defending the island. The island of New Guinea represented terrain unlike anything most American soldiers had ever encountered. Stretching over 1,300 miles from east to west, it was the second largest island in the world, covered in some of the most impenetrable jungle on Earth. Mountains rose to over 16,000 feet, creating a spine down the island's center, while coastal regions were dominated by swamps, mangrove forests, and rivers that could rise 20 feet overnight during the monsoon season. The density of the vegetation was almost incomprehensible to those who hadn't experienced it. In many areas, visibility was limited to less than 10 feet, with interlocking trees creating a canopy so thick that midday on the jungle floor resembled twilight. Vines, thorns, and tangled undergrowth made movement exhausting. Soldiers often had to hack their way forward inch by inch with machetes. A single mile in such conditions could take an entire day to traverse. The climate was equally challenging. Daytime temperatures regularly exceeded 100 degrees Fahrenheit, with humidity approaching 100%. Soldiers' uniforms would be soaked through with sweat within minutes of beginning a patrol, leading to painful chafing and fungal infections. Nights brought little relief as temperatures remained high and mosquitoes descended in clouds so thick that men would inhale them while breathing. During the monsoon season, torrential downpours could deliver up to 12 inches of rain in a 24-hour period, turning trails into waist-deep mud and causing flash floods that could sweep away entire squads. But perhaps the most formidable aspect of the New Guinea environment was its disease burden. Malaria was endemic, with infection rates approaching 100% in units without proper prophylaxis. Dengue fever, scrub typhus, dysentery, and fungal infections decimated American units. Tropical ulcers could develop from the smallest scratch. Within days, a minor abrasion could become a gaping, infected wound that penetrated to the bone. Even the plant life posed dangers, with numerous species causing painful rashes, blindness, or respiratory distress when touched or burned as firewood. The Japanese had seized the northern coast of New Guinea in the early months of 1942 and were pushing south across the Owen-Stanley Mountains toward Port Moresby. If they captured this vital port on the southern coast, they would have a perfect staging ground for an invasion of Australia. General Douglas MacArthur, who had been forced to flee the Philippines with the famous promise, "I shall return," established his headquarters in Australia and began planning the Allied counteroffensive. The 32nd Infantry Division would be among the first American combat units to face the Japanese in New Guinea. In September 1942, elements of the division began arriving in Port Moresby to reinforce Australian troops who had been fighting a desperate holding action along the Kokoda Trail, a narrow, muddy path that wound through the mountains from the northern coast to Port Moresby. The Americans were wholly unprepared for what awaited them. Their training had focused on conventional European-style warfare, open battlefields, clear front lines, and predictable logistics. The jungle offered none of these. Visibility was often limited to less than 20 yards. The constant humidity meant weapons rusted overnight. Radios failed in the dense vegetation. Maps were wildly inaccurate, and the enemy seemed to materialize from nowhere, striking with deadly precision before melting back into the green maze. Captain Louis Bulow, a company commander in the 126th Infantry, recorded his first impressions in a letter home that was later published in the Milwaukee Journal. "Nothing in my military education prepared me for this place. The jungle swallows men whole. Yesterday we lost an entire patrol, not to enemy action, but simply because they stepped off the trail and couldn't find their way back. We heard them calling for hours before the voices stopped. I don't know if they were found by our men or the Japanese or just died out there in the green darkness. Even worse, the Japanese soldiers they faced were veterans of jungle campaigns in Malaya and the Philippines. They had adapted their tactics, equipment, and training to the unique challenges of jungle warfare. They moved silently through terrain the Americans found nearly impassable. They set ingenious ambushes using natural camouflage, and they seemed immune to the diseases and parasites that quickly began devastating American units. The Japanese soldiers' equipment was specifically designed for jungle operations. Their uniforms were lightweight and quick-drying, unlike the heavy American cotton fatigues that remained wet for days. They carried smaller, lighter weapons that were less likely to snag on vegetation. Their diet of rice and dried fish was compact and didn't spoil in the heat. And perhaps most importantly, they had developed tactical doctrines perfectly suited to jungle fighting, emphasizing stealth, ambush, and night operations. By contrast, American soldiers arrived burdened with equipment designed for European battlefields. Their heavy steel helmets collected rainwater and caused neck strain during long patrols. Their leather boots quickly rotted in the constant moisture. Their weapons, particularly the M1 Garand rifle with its long barrel and wooden stock, proved unwieldy in dense vegetation. Even their rations were problematic, with canned foods adding unnecessary weight and creating garbage that had to be carried to avoid alerting the enemy to their presence. Within weeks, the 32nd Division was in serious trouble. Disease rates soared, with malaria, dengue fever, and dysentery affecting up to 70% of some units. Standard Army boots rotted in the constant moisture. Uniforms designed for European weather provided no protection against the alternating downpours and steam bath heat. Food spoiled rapidly, and water purification tablets imparted a chemical taste that made many soldiers risk drinking untreated water, leading to further illness. By the third week, my company was down to 35 effective men out of 196, recalled Captain Edward Moran of Eek Company, 126th Infantry. We had more men in field hospitals with malaria and foot rot than we had on the front lines. Those still able to fight were operating on willpower alone, hollow-eyed, shaking with fever, their uniforms in tatters and their weapons coated in rust, despite hours of maintenance each day. But most critical was the tactical disadvantage. American units moved noisily through the jungle, followed established trails that were easily ambushed, and relied on firepower over stealth, all fatal mistakes against an enemy that had mastered the art of jungle warfare. Standard American tactical doctrine emphasized linear formations, interlocking fields of fire, and the concentration of forces at decisive points. These concepts, developed for open European battlefields, proved disastrously inappropriate in the jungle. Linear formations were impossible to maintain in dense vegetation, and concentration of forces simply created larger, more vulnerable targets for Japanese ambushes. The limited visibility meant that interlocking fields of fire existed only in theory. In practice, squads often couldn't see or support adjacent units even when they were only yards apart. Communications presented another critical challenge. The SCR-300 radio, the primary communication tool for infantry companies, had an effective range of 3 to 5 miles in open terrain. In the dense jungle, that range was reduced to a few hundred yards at best, and often the radios didn't work at all. Units found themselves isolated, unable to coordinate with adjacent forces or call for artillery support when engaged by the enemy. It was in this desperate situation that men like Sergeant Daniel Westmoreland began developing the improvised tactics and techniques that would eventually transform the U.S. Army's approach to jungle warfare. Their innovations weren't sanctioned by higher headquarters or found in any field manual. They were born of necessity and often required disregarding standard operating procedures. Westmoreland's reconnaissance platoon was among the first units to adapt to jungle conditions. They discarded much of their standard equipment, keeping only essentials that could be carried silently. Steel helmets were replaced with cloth caps or Australian bush hats that wouldn't catch on low-hanging branches. Canteen cups and metal mess kits were left behind. The noise they made when accidentally struck against equipment had given away more than one American position. Ammunition was carried loose in cloth bandoliers rather than in metal clips that could rattle. Even their weapons underwent transformation. Westmoreland encouraged his men to shorten the stocks of their M1 rifles to make them more manageable in confined spaces. Machine gunners discarded the heavy tripods for their weapons, instead developing improvised bipods made from tree branches, lashed together with parachute cord. Thompson submachine guns, with their shorter barrels and higher rate of fire, became prized possessions for jungle fighters, though they remained in short supply. Westmoreland taught us to think differently about everything, remembered Corporal Frank Martinez, a member of the reconnaissance platoon. He'd say, "Forget what you learned in training. In this jungle, noise equals death." He showed us how to wrap cloth around our dog tags so they wouldn't clink together, how to move through undergrowth by parting it gently rather than pushing through, how to place each foot carefully to avoid breaking twigs. These weren't things the Army taught us. They were hunting skills he'd brought from Pennsylvania. Perhaps most importantly, Westmoreland developed new movement techniques specifically adapted to jungle conditions. Rather than the standard file formation used on narrow trails, which made units vulnerable to ambush, he created what became known as the jungle diamond. In this formation, the point man was followed by elements to both the right and left of the trail, with the platoon leader in the center and a rear security team watching their back trail. This arrangement provided all-around security and ensured that an ambush couldn't catch the entire unit in a single kill zone. He also introduced the concept of broken trail movement. Rather than following established paths that were likely to be observed or ambushed by the enemy, his units would move parallel to trails, just far enough into the jungle to remain invisible from the path but close enough to use it for navigation. This technique dramatically reduced the effectiveness of Japanese ambushes and allowed American forces to surprise enemy units that were oriented toward the trails. By October 1942, the situation had grown so dire that General MacArthur sent Lieutenant General Robert Eichelberger to take personal command of the faltering operation. His orders were blunt: take Buna or don't come back alive. Buna was a Japanese stronghold on the northern coast, and the Americans had made little progress toward capturing it. Eichelberger's arrival marked a turning point in the campaign. Unlike many senior officers who remained at headquarters in Port Moresby or Australia, Eichelberger went directly to the front lines to assess the situation firsthand. What he found was shocking. American units decimated by disease and combat losses, equipment failing in jungle conditions, and tactics that were wholly inappropriate for the environment. I found the men in a state approaching complete exhaustion, Eichelberger later wrote in his memoir. Many were suffering from malaria, dysentery, and jungle rot. Their uniforms were in tatters, their weapons in poor condition despite their best efforts at maintenance. But what struck me most was their sense of abandonment. They felt they had been thrown into a situation for which they were completely unprepared, with equipment unsuited to the environment and tactical doctrine that was worse than useless. Eichelberger immediately recognized that traditional tactics were failing catastrophically. He began seeking out non-commissioned officers and junior officers who had shown adaptability in the jungle environment. Sergeant Westmoreland was among those identified for his innovations in small unit jungle movement and his successful reconnaissance missions. When Westmoreland was brought to the general's makeshift headquarters, a canvas tent perched on a muddy hillside, he found Eichelberger surrounded by maps and reports. The general looked up and asked without preamble, "Sergeant, I'm told you figured out how to move through this God-forsaken jungle without getting your men killed. How are you doing it? Westmoreland hesitated, then admitted he had been disregarding several standard operating procedures. Rather than moving in the prescribed formation, he had developed a jungle diamond pattern that kept his men close enough for visual contact, but dispersed enough to prevent a single ambush from catching the entire unit. He had trained his men to step precisely where the man ahead had stepped, minimizing noise and disturbance to the vegetation. And most controversially, he had modified their equipment, discarding anything that made noise or wasn't absolutely essential. "Sir, we've stripped down to the bare minimum," he explained. "No mess kits, they clank, no canteen cups. Same reason. We've wrapped tape around anything metal. We've even modified our weapons." This last admission raised eyebrows. Modifying issue weapons was strictly prohibited. But Westmoreland explained that the standard M1 Garand rifle was too long for the dense jungle, frequently snagging on vines and branches. His men had shortened the stocks on some weapons and developed techniques for moving that kept the barrels from becoming entangled. Rather than reprimanding him, Eichelberger recognized the value of these field innovations. "Sergeant, I want you to train other squad leaders in these techniques. Starting tomorrow, you'll run a 3-day course for select personnel from each company." Thus began one of the most unusual training programs of the war, a combat soldier teaching officers and NCOs how to disregard certain aspects of their formal training in favor of techniques that actually worked in the jungle. The Westmoreland course, as it informally became known, rapidly spread through the division. Soldiers learned to move silently, to navigate without compasses that often proved unreliable under the jungle canopy, to identify edible plants, to treat tropical infections with improvised remedies, and to modify their equipment for maximum effectiveness in the dense vegetation. The course took place in a cleared area about a mile behind the front lines. Each morning, a new group of 20 to 30 soldiers, primarily squad leaders and platoon sergeants, would arrive for training. They would begin by surrendering much of their standard equipment, which Westmoreland dismissed as noisemakers and backbreakers. In place of regulation gear, they received improvised equipment that had proven effective in jungle conditions. "First day was a shock to most of us," recalled Sergeant William Poole of the 126th Infantry. "This staff sergeant has us pile up our helmets, entrenching tools, most of our rations, things we'd been told were essential. Then he hands out these homemade bandoliers and tells us to transfer our ammunition. He's got us wrapping our boots with strips of tent canvas to muffle our footsteps and showing us how to make face paint from certain types of mud. Half of us thought he was crazy. The other half were scared we'd get court-martialed for modifying government equipment." The morning session focused on movement techniques, how to navigate using natural features rather than unreliable compasses, how to move silently through different types of vegetation, how to cross streams without leaving obvious tracks. In the afternoon, trainees practiced detecting and setting up ambushes, establishing observation posts, and constructing hasty defensive positions using natural materials. But the most valuable lessons came during the night exercises. Westmoreland would lead the group deep into the jungle after dark, teaching them to use their senses in new ways. Trainees learned to distinguish between normal jungle sounds and those made by humans, to identify different types of vegetation by touch rather than sight, and to maintain their orientation without visual landmarks. These skills proved invaluable in an environment where much of the fighting took place in near-complete darkness. "Night in the jungle is absolute blackness," Westmoreland would tell them. "You won't see your hand in front of your face. But the Japs move at night, and if we can't do the same, we'll always be reacting instead of acting." He developed exercises where trainees had to navigate by feel alone, following a rope strung through the jungle without using flashlights. Others involved identifying objects by touch or determining the direction of artificially created sounds. The most significant innovation, however, was in combat tactics. Westmoreland had observed that Japanese ambushes typically targeted trails and natural movement corridors. His response was to develop what he called parallel tracking, moving slightly off established paths while maintaining visual contact with them. This simple but revolutionary approach dramatically reduced the effectiveness of enemy ambushes and allowed American units to surprise Japanese positions that had been oriented to defend against frontal approaches. The Japs expect us to use the trails because that's what American troops have been doing since we got here, Westmoreland explained. They site their ambushes and fighting positions to cover those approaches. But if we move 10 yards off the trail, we can see them before they see us. We can hit them from the flank or even from behind. He also introduced the concept of jungle ears, the practice of stopping movement completely at regular intervals to listen for enemy activity. American troops had a tendency to move continuously, generating a constant background of noise that masked the sounds of Japanese movements. By implementing mandatory listening halts every 15 minutes, patrols could detect enemy forces that would otherwise have remained hidden. Perhaps most controversial was Westmoreland's approach to firefights in the jungle. Standard doctrine emphasized establishing a base of fire, fixing the enemy in position, then maneuvering to the flank. But in the dense vegetation, such textbook maneuvers were often impossible. Westmoreland instead taught a technique he called shoot and scoot, delivering a heavy volume of fire into the enemy position, then immediately changing location before return fire could be effectively directed. In this jungle, the first 30 seconds of a firefight determine who lives and who dies, he told his trainees. You hit hard, you hit fast, and then you move before they can bring their heavy weapons to bear. Forget about establishing a perfect firing line or waiting for the perfect flanking position. In the time it takes to set that up, the Japs will either disappear or call in reinforcements to surround you. By early November, units that had adopted these improvised techniques were showing significantly higher success rates in patrol actions and suffering fewer casualties from ambushes. General Eichelberger, recognizing the value of this battlefield adaptation, began formalizing some of these innovations into official guidance, though much of it remained unofficial, passed from soldier to soldier rather than through formal channels. The true test came in late November when the Allies launched their major offensive against Buna. The fighting was brutal, with Japanese troops entrenched in coconut log bunkers that proved nearly impervious to infantry weapons. Traditional frontal assaults resulted in devastating casualties. The Japanese defenses at Buna represented a masterclass in jungle fortification. They had constructed interlocking bunkers using coconut logs up to 3 feet thick, reinforced with sand and earth that absorbed even direct hits from light artillery. The bunkers were camouflaged so effectively that American troops often didn't spot them until they were within 20 yards, well inside the killing zone of Japanese machine guns. Connecting trenches allowed defenders to move between positions without exposure, and carefully planned fields of fire ensured that any approach was covered by multiple weapons. Against these fortifications, conventional tactics proved suicidal. The standard approach of suppressing enemy positions with covering fire, then advancing by bounds, simply didn't work when the covering fire had no effect on the bunkers, and the dense vegetation made coordinated movement nearly impossible. One company of the 126th Infantry lost 57 men in a single day attempting to advance using textbook tactics against these positions. It was during this stalemate that Sergeant Westmoreland proposed another innovation that violated standard doctrine, but offered a potential solution. Observing that the Japanese bunkers had firing ports with limited fields of fire, he suggested that small, lightly equipped teams could approach from multiple directions simultaneously, using the jungle itself as concealment. Once in position, they could disable the bunkers with grenades or improvised explosives placed directly at the firing ports or on the roof, areas the Japanese had difficulty defending. This approach, which came to be known as spider tactics, due to the multiple approach paths that resembled a spider's legs, was initially rejected by company-level officers as too risky. But after several costly, failed assaults, a desperate battalion commander authorized Westmoreland to attempt his approach on a particularly troublesome bunker that had already repulsed 3 conventional attacks. In the pre-dawn darkness of December 4, 1942, Westmoreland led a 9-man team through the dense undergrowth. Moving with the stealth techniques they had perfected over weeks in the jungle, they approached the Japanese position from 3 different directions. At first light, they simultaneously rushed the bunker from angles the defenders couldn't effectively cover, tossing grenades through the firing slits and placing satchel charges on the roof. The bunker was neutralized with no American casualties. What Westmoreland did that morning changed how we fought for the rest of the campaign, remembered Lieutenant Robert Wolfson, who observed the action. It was like a light bulb went on for everyone watching. We'd been trying to fight European-style warfare in a jungle environment, and it was killing us. Here was a completely different approach that actually worked. This success led to the rapid adoption of spider tactics throughout the division. Over the next several weeks, the Americans slowly pushed forward, neutralizing one Japanese strong point after another using these unconventional methods. By January 8, 1943, they had secured the Buna area, and by January 22nd, the entire Japanese force in the region had been defeated. The victory came at a terrible cost. Of the 9,200 men of the 32nd Division who participated in the campaign, over 2,500 became casualties, nearly 700 killed in action, and the rest wounded or incapacitated by disease. But the lessons learned in this brutal crucible would prove invaluable as the war in the Pacific continued. One of the most important innovations to emerge from the Buna campaign was in the area of field medicine. The environment of New Guinea created medical challenges unlike anything American doctors had encountered. Wounds that would have been relatively minor in Europe became life-threatening in the jungle, where bacteria thrived in the warm, humid conditions, and even small cuts could develop into massive infections within days. Captain Paul Miller, a battalion surgeon with the 32nd Division, worked closely with Westmoreland to develop new protocols for field treatment. They discovered that standard wound dressings quickly became saturated in the humid environment, actually promoting rather than preventing infection. In response, they began using a mixture of sulfa powder and locally sourced plant materials with natural antiseptic properties. The medical manual was worse than useless in these conditions, Miller later wrote in a report to the Army Surgeon General. Everything we'd been taught about wound management had to be reconsidered in light of the jungle environment. We found that allowing certain wounds to remain open rather than tightly bandaged resulted in better healing. We discovered that some local plants contained compounds more effective than our issued medications for treating fungal infections, and we developed entirely new approaches to preventing malaria that weren't covered in any field manual. Transportation of wounded soldiers presented another critical challenge. The dense jungle and muddy terrain made evacuations extraordinarily difficult. Standard stretchers were too wide for narrow jungle paths and became impossibly heavy when waterlogged. Westmoreland and his men developed improvised stretchers using saplings and parachute material that were lighter, narrower, and shed water rather than absorbing it. We could move a wounded man twice as far with half the fatigue using Westmoreland's jungle stretchers, remembered medic Thomas Kaplan. They weren't pretty, but they saved lives by getting casualties to aid stations hours faster than would have been possible with standard equipment. Equally important were innovations in water purification and food handling. The issued iodine tablets left water with such an unpalatable taste that many soldiers refused to use them, instead drinking untreated water that led to widespread dysentery. Westmoreland introduced a filtering system using layered cloth and charcoal from campfires that removed particulates and improved the taste without compromising the purification process. Food spoilage was another constant challenge. Standard rations quickly rotted in the heat and humidity, and resupply was often delayed by weather or enemy action. Westmoreland taught his men techniques for identifying edible local plants and preserving perishable rations by smoking or sun-drying them, skills he had learned during hunting trips in Pennsylvania. We were supposed to carry these heavy canned rations that would last maybe 3 days before they rusted through or spoiled, explained Private George Henley. Westmoreland showed us how to catch fish using improvised hooks and lines, how to identify which fruits and roots were safe to eat, and how to smoke meat so it would last for weeks. These weren't military skills. They were survival skills that happened to be perfect for jungle warfare. Communications techniques also evolved rapidly. The standard radio equipment proved unreliable in the jungle environment, with dense vegetation blocking transmissions and humidity causing frequent equipment failures. In response, Westmoreland's reconnaissance teams developed a system of relay stations, positioning men with radios at elevated points where signals could penetrate the canopy. They also created a standardized set of nonverbal signals using bird calls and physical signs that allowed units to communicate when electronic means failed. We had to completely rethink how we shared information, said Lieutenant James Wilson, a communications officer with the division. The textbook procedures for establishing radio nets simply didn't work in the jungle. We found that shorter antennas actually performed better in some situations, that certain frequencies were less affected by vegetation, and that we needed completely different network topologies than what we'd been taught. By early 1943, the U.S. Army had begun a fundamental transformation in how it approached jungle warfare. Equipment was modified or redesigned specifically for tropical conditions. Uniforms were developed from lightweight, quick-drying materials. Weapons were adapted for the close-quarters combat typical of jungle engagements. Medical procedures were revised to address tropical diseases and the unique challenges of treating wounds in high-humidity environments. General MacArthur, recognizing that future operations would require specialized jungle warfare training, authorized the establishment of the Jungle Warfare School in Australia. Many of the techniques developed by Westmoreland and others were incorporated into the curriculum, formalizing the improvised adaptations that had emerged from necessity on the battlefield. The school was established at Canungra in the rainforests of Queensland, where terrain somewhat resembled the jungles of New Guinea. Australian instructors, many of whom had fought along the Kokoda Trail, worked alongside American veterans of Boona to create a comprehensive training program that covered everything from survival skills to small unit tactics adapted for jungle conditions. Canungra was unlike any military training facility that had existed before, wrote Lieutenant Colonel Henry Nash, one of the school's first commanders. We weren't teaching by the book because there was no book for what we were doing. We were creating a new doctrine from scratch, based entirely on battlefield experience rather than theoretical principles. And we were teaching soldiers to think independently, to adapt standard procedures to the jungle environment, and to improvise when necessary, concepts that ran counter to traditional military training philosophy. The curriculum was intensely practical. Students spent minimal time in classrooms and maximum time in the jungle, learning through direct experience. They conducted extended patrols carrying only what they could comfortably manage, foregoing many items considered essential in conventional operations. They practiced setting and detecting ambushes, establishing observation posts, and constructing defensive positions using natural materials. They learned to identify edible and medicinal plants, to purify water using improvised methods, and to treat tropical diseases and infections with limited medical supplies. Perhaps most importantly, they were taught to question doctrine that didn't work in jungle conditions and to develop alternative approaches based on the specific challenges they faced. This emphasis on adaptation and innovation represented a significant departure from traditional military training, which typically stressed adherence to established procedures. Sergeant Daniel Westmoreland was eventually awarded the Distinguished Service Cross for his actions during the Boona campaign, particularly for his leadership in developing the spider tactics that broke the stalemate at the Japanese bunker line. The citation noted his extraordinary heroism and tactical innovation that saved countless American lives and contributed significantly to the success of the operation. But his greatest contribution may have been the informal jungle warfare school he established. By the time the 32nd Division was withdrawn from the front lines in February 1943 for rest and reorganization, more than 500 soldiers had gone through Westmoreland's improvised training. These men, in turn, became instructors for others, creating a multiplier effect that spread these battle-tested techniques throughout the Pacific Theater. In a letter to his fiancée Margaret in March 1943, Westmoreland reflected on his experiences. "What I've learned here is that sometimes the rulebook has to be thrown away. The Army trained us for one kind of war, but we're fighting something completely different. The men who survive are the ones who can adapt, who can look at a situation with fresh eyes and find solutions that aren't in any manual. I've seen Harvard graduates completely fall apart here, while farm boys with an 8th grade education become natural leaders because they know how to improvise and adapt. If there's one thing I hope the Army learns from all this suffering, it's that you have to prepare soldiers to think, not just to follow procedures." This philosophy would eventually permeate American military training, though the process was slow and inconsistent. By 1944, specialized jungle warfare schools had been established throughout the Pacific Theater, and many of the innovations developed at Buna had been incorporated into formal doctrine. But the tendency to revert to conventional approaches remained strong, especially among officers trained in traditional military thinking. The Japanese patrol that had passed by Westmoreland's position on that rain-soaked January day in 1943 never suspected the presence of American observers. Using the silent movement techniques he had perfected, Westmoreland and his men shadowed the patrol back to their headquarters, a small cluster of thatched huts concealed beneath the jungle canopy. What they discovered there changed the course of the campaign. The Japanese officer was indeed carrying maps, detailed plans for a counterattack that would have caught the exhausted American forces by surprise. Westmoreland knew that standard procedure required him to report this intelligence and await orders. But he also knew that the monsoon rains had made radio communication unreliable, and the attack was scheduled for dawn the next day. In a decision that violated direct orders against engaging the enemy during reconnaissance missions, Westmoreland led his 12-man patrol in a daring night assault on the Japanese headquarters. Using the infiltration techniques they had developed, they approached to within yards of the command post without detection. At Westmoreland's signal, they attacked with grenades and suppressed submachine gun fire, targeting the officers' quarters and communications equipment. The operation was over in minutes. The Japanese command structure for the planned counterattack was eliminated, and Westmoreland's men captured the attack plans intact. They withdrew into the jungle before reinforcements could arrive, leaving the enemy force leaderless and confused. When Westmoreland returned to American lines and reported his actions, he expected to be court-martialed for disobeying the strict reconnaissance-only orders. Instead, General Eichelberger personally commended him. "Sergeant, if you'd followed standard procedure, we'd be fighting for our lives right now." Sometimes the book needs to be rewritten. That encounter became emblematic of the evolving approach to jungle warfare. The rigid adherence to pre-war doctrine was giving way to a more adaptive, flexible approach that recognized the unique challenges of fighting in the Pacific Theater. Soldiers who could think independently and adapt to the environment became the most valuable assets in the jungle campaign. Private First Class Michael Collins, who served under Westmoreland in the reconnaissance platoon, later reflected on his leader's impact. "Before I met Westmoreland, I thought being a good soldier meant following orders exactly. He taught us that sometimes being a good soldier means using your judgment, even if it means breaking some rules. When lives are on the line and conditions are nothing like what headquarters imagines, you have to trust your instincts and your training." That was the real lesson of jungle warfare. That adaptation is more important than rigid adherence to doctrine. As the war progressed, the lessons learned in New Guinea spread throughout the Pacific. The Army established formal jungle warfare training centers in Hawaii, New Caledonia, and eventually the Philippines. By 1944, soldiers deploying to the Pacific Theater underwent specialized training that incorporated many of the innovations developed by Westmoreland and others during those early desperate months in New Guinea. The impact was evident in subsequent campaigns. When American forces landed on Biak, New Britain, and the Philippines, they moved with a confidence and competence in jungle operations that had been entirely absent in 1942. Equipment had been adapted, tactics refined, and, most importantly, a mindset of adaptation and innovation had taken root. The difference between our operations in 1942 and 1944 was night and day, observed Colonel Walter Johnson, a regimental commander who served throughout the Pacific Campaign. In 42, we were stumbling around the jungle like blind men, making every mistake possible and paying for them in blood. By 44, we owned the jungle. Our troops moved through it like it was their natural habitat. They knew how to use the environment against the enemy instead of letting it be used against them. And that transformation came not from headquarters directives, but from the innovations of frontline soldiers who figured out what actually worked. Even the Japanese noticed the change. Captured documents from late 1944 revealed their surprise at how quickly the Americans had mastered jungle warfare. One Japanese officer wrote in his diary, "The Americans learn too fast. They now move through the jungle like ghosts, where before they crashed like elephants." Major General Jinsaburo Sensui, who commanded Japanese forces on Leyte, wrote in a post-war memoir, "When the Americans first came to the Pacific, we considered them children in the jungle, noisy, clumsy, and predictable. By 1944, they had become masters of jungle combat, often surpassing our own capabilities. Their ability to adapt and innovate was far greater than we had anticipated, and it proved to be one of the decisive factors in the war." Daniel Westmoreland continued to serve throughout the Pacific Campaign, eventually rising to the rank of captain through battlefield commission. He participated in operations in the Philippines and was preparing for the invasion of Japan when the atomic bombs brought the war to an abrupt end. Throughout his service, he maintained his philosophy of adaptation and innovation. As an officer, he encouraged his men to question procedures that didn't make sense in jungle conditions and to develop alternatives that better suited the environment. He established informal training programs at each new location, passing on the techniques he had developed at Buna to fresh troops arriving in the theater. Captain Westmoreland was unlike any officer I'd served under, remembered Lieutenant Frank Harris, who served as Westmoreland's executive officer in the Philippines. Most officers insisted on doing things by the book, even when the book was clearly wrong for jungle conditions. Westmoreland would tell us, "There's the official way, there's the right way, and then there's the way that keeps you alive." I'm interested in the third one. He encouraged us to think independently and to trust our judgment rather than blindly following procedures. After the war, Westmoreland was among the veterans consulted by the Army as it formalized its jungle warfare doctrine. Many of the techniques he had developed under fire became standard procedures taught to generations of soldiers who would later fight in the jungles of Vietnam, though few would know the origin of these tactics or the name of the sergeant who first improvised them out of desperate necessity. He also contributed to the development of specialized equipment for jungle warfare. His insights into the practical requirements of operating in tropical environments influenced the design of lightweight boots, quick-drying uniforms, and weapons better suited to close-quarter jungle combat. Many of these innovations would later be standardized as the M1956 load-carrying equipment and the M16 rifle, tools specifically designed for the challenges of fighting in dense vegetation. The Pacific War forced the U.S. military to confront an uncomfortable truth, that preparation for one type of warfare can leave forces dangerously vulnerable when facing different combat environments. The transformation from conventional European-style combat to effective jungle warfare required not just new equipment and tactics, but a fundamental shift in how soldiers were trained to think and adapt. The jungle taught us humility. wrote General Eichelberger in his memoir. We came to New Guinea believing we were the best equipped, best trained army in the world, only to discover that our equipment was inappropriate, our training irrelevant, and our doctrine counterproductive for the environment we faced. It was only through the innovation and adaptation of individual soldiers that we eventually prevailed. The lesson is clear. Military forces must be prepared not just with specific tactics and equipment, but with the mental flexibility to adapt when conditions render those tactics and equipment obsolete. In the decades following World War II, the Army institutionalized many lessons from the jungle campaigns. Special warfare schools incorporated the innovations developed by soldiers like Westmoreland. Equipment design began to consider a wider range of operational environments. Perhaps most importantly, adaptability and innovation became recognized as essential military virtues, not just desirable traits. Yet the most profound lesson may be how quickly institutional knowledge can be lost when not continually refreshed through training and experience. By the time American forces found themselves fighting in the jungles of Vietnam, many of the hard-learned lessons from New Guinea had faded from institutional memory, requiring a new generation of soldiers to relearn them, often at great cost. Colonel David Heckworth, who served in both Korea and Vietnam, observed this phenomenon in his memoir. We seem destined to relearn the same lessons in blood with each new conflict. The jungle fighting techniques that cost so many lives to develop in World War II had been largely forgotten by the time we entered Vietnam. We had to relearn them all over again, paying the same price in casualties as our fathers had. It's a tragic cycle that speaks to a fundamental flaw in how military institutions preserve and transmit knowledge. Daniel Westmoreland returned to Pennsylvania after the war, using his mechanical skills to start a small machine shop that eventually grew into a successful business manufacturing specialized equipment for the mining industry. He rarely spoke about his wartime experiences, though he maintained correspondence with several members of his old reconnaissance platoon until his death in 1986. He married Margaret Jensen in September 1945, just weeks after returning from the Pacific. They raised 3 children, 2 sons and a daughter, all of whom would later serve in the military, carrying forward their father's legacy of service. His oldest son, James, would fight in Vietnam, where he found himself facing many of the same jungle warfare challenges his father had confronted 2 decades earlier. Dad never pushed us toward military service, James Westmoreland recalled, but he did instill in us certain values: adaptability, self-reliance, and a willingness to question authority when necessary. He believed those qualities were essential not just for soldiers, but for life in general. And when I found myself in the jungles of Vietnam, I often heard his voice in my head, guiding me through situations that no training manual could have prepared me for. Among his personal effects, his family found a small notebook filled with detailed sketches and notes about jungle warfare techniques, improvised weapons modifications, silent movement methods, camouflage applications, and tactical innovations. On the inside cover was a simple inscription, "Because the book didn't work." This humble document, now preserved in the U.S. Army Military History Institute, provides a rare first-hand record of the battlefield innovations that transformed American capabilities in the Pacific Theater. In 2003, during Operation Iraqi Freedom, a new generation of American soldiers would again find themselves adapting doctrine and equipment to an unanticipated battlefield environment. Lieutenant Colonel Michael Westmoreland, Daniel's grandson, served with the 4th Infantry Division during the insurgency phase of the conflict. Like his grandfather before him, he found that standard procedures often failed to address the realities on the ground. "I often thought about my grandfather during that deployment," he later wrote. "We were facing a different environment, but the same fundamental challenge: how to adapt when doctrine doesn't match reality." I had his jungle notebook with me, not because the specific techniques were applicable, but because it reminded me that innovation and adaptation have always been the true American military tradition. Sometimes the most important qualification for leadership is the courage to discard what doesn't work and develop something that does. The story of Sergeant Westmoreland and the jungle soldiers of New Guinea highlights a truth about warfare that transcends any particular conflict. That official doctrine and formal training can never fully prepare soldiers for the realities they will face. It is often the improvisation, adaptation, and sometimes the necessary disobedience of those at the tactical level that develops the most effective approaches to combat. In the dense jungles of New Guinea, far from the planning rooms of Washington, a generation of American soldiers learned this lesson through bitter experience. They discovered that survival and victory depended not on rigidly following procedures designed for different circumstances, but on their ability to adapt, innovate, and overcome. Qualities that would serve American forces well throughout the Pacific Campaign and beyond. Their legacy lives on in the training of today's Special Operations Forces, who continue to emphasize adaptability, innovation, and mission-focused flexibility over rigid adherence to doctrine. The jungle fighters of World War II would recognize in these modern warriors the same spirit of improvisation and tactical creativity that allowed them to prevail in some of the most challenging terrain on Earth. As we reflect on their accomplishments, a question emerges that resonates across generations of military service. When faced with a conflict between following orders and accomplishing the mission, what would you do? Would you adhere to procedures you knew were failing, or would you have the courage to innovate, even at personal risk? The jungle soldiers of New Guinea made their choice, and in doing so, they not only survived their immediate challenges, but transformed an army. Their story reminds us that sometimes the most valuable military asset is not technology or firepower, but the human capacity for adaptation and innovation in the face of adversity. In an era when warfare is increasingly dominated by technology, the lessons of the Jungle Campaign remain profoundly relevant. They remind us that no matter how sophisticated our weapon systems or how detailed our doctrine, warfare ultimately remains a human endeavor. It is the creativity, adaptability, and determination of individual soldiers that often make the difference between victory and defeat, especially when facing unexpected challenges in unfamiliar environments. The men who fought in the green hell of New Guinea, men like Daniel Westmoreland, deserve to be remembered not just for their courage in combat, but for their intellectual courage in questioning failed approaches and developing innovative alternatives. They remind us that true military effectiveness comes not from rigid adherence to doctrine, but from the ability to adapt that doctrine to the realities of the battlefield. Share this forgotten chapter of courage so others will remember how a handful of soldiers, willing to break the rules when necessary, changed the course of a war and saved countless American lives through their battlefield innovations and adaptations to the green hell of the Pacific jungle.